With only hours left before his execution, Scott Bennett's final request wasn't for a last meal or a chaplain's blessing. It was to see his dog one last time. The clock on the prison wall ticked relentlessly towards 6 a.m., each second bringing him closer to death by lethal injection. "Kaiser," he whispered to Warden Peterson, his voice cracking with emotion. "I just want to see Kaiser before I go." The warden's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips, eyes widening as if he'd heard something far more shocking than a condemned man asking for his pet. What should have been a simple denial became, in that moment, a moral crisis that rippled through Oakwood Prison. Officer Blake Turner's face drained of color, keys jangling as his hand trembled against his belt. The senior guard, who had overseen 12 executions without flinching, suddenly couldn't meet anyone's eyes. 7 years since Scott's conviction, 7 years since anyone had mentioned the German shepherd who'd howled for days after they took his master away. "Find the dog," Peterson ordered, though something in his gut told him this simple request would unravel everything. What truth could a dying man's dog possibly reveal after all this time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The harsh, fluorescent lights of Oakwood Maximum Security Prison cast long shadows across Scott Bennett's face as he sat on the edge of his narrow bed. At 58, his once powerful frame had withered during his 7 years on death row. His dark hair had turned completely silver, and deep lines etched his weathered face like dry riverbeds. Only his piercing blue eyes retained their intensity, windows to a soul that maintained its dignity despite everything that had been taken from him. Scott had once been among the most respected canine officers in the state of Texas. His intuitive understanding of dogs and unwavering calm under pressure had made him legendary within the department. Alongside Kaiser, his German shepherd partner, he'd solved cases that had stumped traditional investigators for months. Their bond transcended the typical handler-dog relationship. They moved as one unit, communicated without commands, trusted each other implicitly. That career ended abruptly 12 years ago when a suspect's bullet shattered Scott's knee during a warehouse raid. Though Kaiser had taken down the shooter seconds later, the damage was done. After rehabilitation, Scott had transitioned to teaching criminal justice at Oakville High School, bringing Kaiser, now retired from police work, with him as an unofficial therapy dog for troubled students. Life had settled into a quieter rhythm until tragedy struck again. Scott lost his wife Sarah and teenage daughter Emily in a horrific car accident 9 years ago, leaving him utterly alone except for Kaiser. The German shepherd had become his lifeline, the only reason Scott found to get out of bed each morning. Kaiser knew, Scott whispered to himself in the darkness of his cell. He always knew when something wasn't right. On the night Janet Reeves was murdered, Scott had gone to her house after receiving a disturbing phone call from his colleague. He'd found her body, bloody and still, on the kitchen floor. Then darkness. A blow from behind. When he regained consciousness, he was surrounded by police officers, Janet's blood on his clothes, a murder weapon with his fingerprints nearby. Kaiser had been found injured in the backyard, a deep cut across his shoulder. No one believed Scott's claims of innocence. His lawyer called it a temporary insanity defense, the grief from losing his family finally breaking him. The prosecutor painted him as a man with violent training who snapped under pressure. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before finding him guilty. Scott had lost everything: his freedom, his home, his reputation, his savings, every appeal exhausted, every new attorney eventually giving up. His execution date had been set, reset, and finally confirmed. Now, with less than 48 hours remaining in his life, Scott clung to one final desire: to see the only living being who had never doubted him, who had tried to protect him that night, who carried the truth in memories no human could access. Kaiser, his partner, his friend, his last connection to a life that seemed like someone else's distant dream. Warden James Peterson sat at his desk, tapping a pen against the polished oak surface as he considered Scott Bennett's unusual request. In his 25 years working in the prison system, he'd heard all manner of last wishes: special meals, religious counseling, final phone calls to estranged family members. But a dog? That was unprecedented. "It's completely out of the question," said Officer Robert Turner, Blake, to his colleagues, standing rigidly near the door. "A maximum security prison isn't a petting zoo." Peterson studied Blake carefully. The 45-year-old security officer had transferred to Oakwood 5 years ago, rising quickly through the ranks with his meticulous attention to protocol and unbending dedication to rules. His service record was spotless, his manner professional if somewhat cold. There was something in his expression now, a tightness around his mouth, a intensity in his eyes that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "I understand your concerns, Blake," Peterson replied, "but Bennett has been a model prisoner. No disciplinary issues, no violence. This is literally his dying wish." "Which makes it all the more suspicious," Blake countered. "Why a dog? Why now? It could be some kind of escape attempt." Officer Elena Ramirez, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally spoke. "With all due respect, how exactly would a 12-year-old German Shepherd help him escape? Bennett is scheduled for execution in less than 48 hours. He knows there's no way out." Blake's jaw tightened. "It sets a dangerous precedent. Next thing you know, every death row inmate will be requesting emotional support pythons or whatever else might disrupt security." Peterson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Where's the dog now? Do we even know if it's still alive?" Ramirez consulted a file. Kaiser was placed with the county animal shelter after Bennett's arrest. He was adopted 2 months later by a retired couple, Richard and Margaret Collins. They still live in Pine Creek, about 40 minutes from here. Peterson made his decision. "Contact the Collins family. Explain the situation. If they're willing to bring the dog in, we'll allow a brief, supervised visit tomorrow morning in the exercise yard. 20 minutes maximum, with full security protocol in place." Blake opened his mouth to protest further, but Peterson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "That's my final decision, Officer Turner. Make the arrangements, Officer Ramirez." After they left his office, Peterson pulled Scott Bennett's file from his drawer. He'd reviewed it countless times over the years, and something had always nagged at him about the case. The evidence had been circumstantial, but damning. Bennett found at the scene, covered in the victim's blood, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, no signs of forced entry at Janet Reeves's home. The prosecution's theory was that Bennett, still unstable from the loss of his family, had developed an obsession with his colleague that turned violent when she rejected him. Yet it didn't align with the man Peterson had come to know over 7 years. Bennett maintained his innocence without the desperate pleading or rage typical of guilty men facing death. There was a quiet dignity to him, a resignation that spoke of a man who had already lost everything that mattered long before his execution date was set. Peterson closed the file and picked up the phone. Maybe this final request was nothing more than a condemned man seeking comfort. But perhaps, and the thought came unbidden, there was something more to it. Something they had all missed. Richard Collins was tending to his vegetable garden when the call came from Oakwood Prison. Margaret took the message, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote down the details. When she hung up, she stood for a long moment in their sun-drenched kitchen, watching her husband through the window as he carefully staked tomato plants in the late afternoon light. "Richard," she called, opening the back door. "You need to come in. It's about Kaiser." At the sound of his name, the aging German shepherd lifted his head from his bed on the porch. Though his muzzle had gone gray and his movements had slowed, his eyes, one brown, one startlingly blue, remained alert and intelligent. Kaiser had been with them for nearly 7 years, and while he had become a beloved companion, Margaret had always sensed he was waiting for someone who would never return. Inside, Margaret explained the prison's request as Richard listened in stunned silence. "They want us to bring Kaiser to see Scott Bennett before his execution," she concluded. "Tomorrow morning." Richard removed his gardening gloves slowly. "That poor man. All this time, and the only one he wants to see is his dog." He looked out the window to where Kaiser had resumed his nap. "Do you think Kaiser even remembers him after all these years?" Margaret thought about the nights she'd found Kaiser sitting by the front window, staring out at the empty street. The way he would sometimes prick up his ears at the sound of a car engine that resembled Scott's old truck. How he'd race to the door whenever a tall, dark-haired man passed by their house, only to retreat with what looked unmistakably like disappointment. "I think he remembers everything," she said softly. "Dogs don't forget the people they love." Richard nodded, his eyes misty. "Then we'll take him. It's the right thing to do." Margaret touched her husband's hand. "There's something else, Richard. Something we've never talked about." He looked at her questioningly. "I've never believed Scott Bennett killed that woman," she said. "And I don't think Kaiser believes it either." Richard was silent for a long moment. "I know," he finally replied. "I've seen the news stories, read about the case. The evidence seemed too convenient somehow. And Kaiser has never shown aggression to anyone in all the years we've had him," Margaret finished. "Not once, except when that new officer from Oakwood came to the neighborhood watch meeting last year. Remember? Kaiser wouldn't stop growling." Richard's eyes widened slightly. "Officer Turner," Margaret nodded. "I didn't think anything of it then. But now I wonder." That night, as they prepared Kaiser for the next day's visit, bathing him and brushing his thick coat until it gleamed, neither spoke of their suspicions. But the same question hung unspoken between them. What if Kaiser knew something about Janet Reeves's murder that no one else did? What if, after 7 long years, the truth was about to come to light just hours before an innocent man was scheduled to die? Scott barely slept that night. He lay awake on his narrow bed, memories washing over him like waves. Kaiser as a puppy, all paws and energy. Kaiser graduating from police dog training at the top of his class. Kaiser lying beside Sarah's and Emily's graves, as if standing guard while Scott sobbed uncontrollably. Kaiser greeting him each morning after the accident, giving him a reason to face another day. And then the fragmented memories of that terrible night. Janet's frantic phone call, the drive to her house in the rain, finding her body, the blinding pain at the base of his skull, Kaiser's warning bark cut short by a yelp of pain. Then darkness, until he awoke to police officers shouting, guns drawn, Kaiser bleeding and sedated by animal control officers. No one had listened when Scott insisted he was innocent. No one questioned why he would call the police himself if he had just committed murder. No one wondered why Kaiser, a trained police dog who obeyed commands perfectly, would have attacked his own handler. No one except Scott seemed to think these details mattered. As dawn broke on what might be his final full day alive, Scott prepared himself for the visit. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel upon seeing Kaiser again. Comfort, certainly. Closure, perhaps. But there was something else. Something he couldn't articulate even to himself. A sense that this meeting was important beyond the obvious emotional reunion. "Maybe I just need him to know I never abandoned him," Scott whispered to the growing light. "Maybe I just need someone to look at me one last time and see who I really am." The prison yard stood empty under the pale morning sun, a stark concrete square surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Officers positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, hands resting on their weapons. In the center, a single metal chair had been placed for Scott Bennett. Warden Peterson had insisted on allowing this unusual visit to occur with as much dignity as possible, though security protocols remained firmly in place. Scott emerged from the prison building flanked by 2 guards. He walked slowly, his ankles shackled, hands cuffed in front of him. Despite the indignity of his restraints and the faded orange jumpsuit, he carried himself with a quiet composure that commanded respect. The morning breeze ruffled his silver hair as he took his seat, eyes fixed on the far gate where Kaiser would appear. 15 minutes, Officer Ramirez reminded him gently. The warden approved removing your handcuffs, but the ankle restraints stay on. Scott nodded, barely hearing her, as the gate began to creak open. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. 7 years. 7 years since he'd seen his best friend, his partner, his last connection to a life that seemed like someone else's distant memory now. Richard Collins appeared first, a tall, thin man in his 70s holding a leather leash, and then, stepping carefully beside him, came Kaiser. The German shepherd moved more slowly than Scott remembered, his powerful stride now measured and deliberate. Gray frosted his muzzle and encircled his eyes like spectacles, but his ears still stood alert. His posture remained proud and strong. The morning light caught his unusual eyes, one deep brown, one ice blue, giving him an almost mystical appearance as he scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. For one heart-stopping moment, Scott feared Kaiser wouldn't recognize him. Too much time had passed. He looked different now, smelled different, the prison's industrial detergent and stale air having replaced his familiar scent. Perhaps the bond that had sustained him through 7 years of solitude existed only in his memories. Then Kaiser's head turned, those mismatched eyes locked onto Scott. The dog froze mid-step, every muscle suddenly tense with attention. "Kaiser," Scott whispered, his voice breaking on the beloved name. The change was instantaneous and extraordinary. Kaiser's ears pricked forward, his tail, which had been hanging low, began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing vigor until his entire hindquarters swayed with the force of it. A high-pitched whine escaped his throat, a sound of such raw emotion that several guards shifted uncomfortably, looking away from the naked vulnerability of the moment. Richard Collins bent down and unclipped the leash. "Go on, boy," he said softly. "Go to him." Kaiser needed no further encouragement. Age and dignity forgotten, he lunged forward with the energy of a much younger dog racing across the yard toward Scott. The officers tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons, but Warden Peterson signaled them to stand down. Scott fell to his knees just as Kaiser reached him, his restrained hands outstretched. The German shepherd slammed into his chest with such force that Scott nearly toppled backward. Kaiser's whines turned to small yelps of joy as he pressed his body against Scott's, trying to climb into his lap despite his size, licking frantically at his face and neck, trembling with the intensity of reunion. "Hey, buddy," Scott managed through tears that came without warning or shame. "Hey, my good boy, I've missed you so much." He buried his face in Kaiser's thick fur, inhaling deeply. This at least was unchanged, the warm, earthy scent that meant home and trust and unconditional love. Kaiser continued to whine and wiggle, circling and pressing against Scott as if trying to reassure himself this wasn't a dream, that his person was really here. There wasn't a dry eye in the yard. Even the most hardened officers looked away, suddenly finding the guard towers or their boots intensely interesting. Richard Collins wiped tears openly from his weathered cheeks. Warden Peterson stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his throat working as he swallowed hard against unexpected emotion. "He's never forgotten you," Richard said, approaching slowly so as not to intrude on their moment. "Every day at sunset he sits by our front window and watches the road." My wife says he's been waiting for you all this time. Scott nodded, unable to speak, as he ran his hands over Kaiser's body, noting new scars, the slight stiffness in his back leg, the softening around his middle that came with age and easier living. Kaiser had grown old waiting for him. The thought brought fresh tears. "Thank you," Scott finally managed, looking up at Richard. "Thank you for taking care of him when I couldn't." "He's a remarkable dog," Richard replied. "We've loved having him, but we've always known he was just staying with us until—" He trailed off, the unspoken reality of Scott's situation hanging in the air between them. Kaiser finally settled, sitting pressed against Scott's side, his head resting on Scott's shoulder, eyes half closed in contentment. Scott continued to stroke his fur, memorizing every detail for the lonely hours ahead. This moment would have to sustain him through what remained of his life. "Mr. Bennett," Richard said hesitantly, "my wife and we've followed your case over the years. We've always had questions about what happened that night." Scott looked up, surprised. "Questions?" "Kaiser is protective, but he's never aggressive without cause. Margaret and I have wondered if he might have witnessed something the night of the murder, something that could have helped your case." Scott's hand stilled on Kaiser's fur. The fragmented memories of that night flashed through his mind again. Janet's body, the blow to his head, Kaiser's warning bark cut short. At that moment, the far door to the yard opened, and Officer Blake Turner emerged. He walked purposefully toward the small group, his face set in its usual stern lines. "Time check," he announced. 5 minutes remaining." Kaiser's transformation was immediate and shocking. His body, which had been relaxed against Scott, suddenly went rigid. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low, rumbling growl began deep in his chest. His lips pulled back, revealing strong white teeth as the growl intensified. "Kaiser?" Scott said, alarmed by the sudden change. "Easy, boy." But Kaiser was fixated on Blake, his mismatched eyes tracking the officer's every movement. The growl deepened, becoming more threatening as Blake took another step closer. "Control your dog, Bennett," Blake snapped, his hand moving to rest on his baton. "Or this visit ends now." Scott placed a calming hand on Kaiser's back, feeling the trembling tension in the dog's muscles. "He doesn't usually react this way," he said, puzzled. "Kaiser, enough." The command that would once have been immediately obeyed was ignored. Kaiser continued to growl, rising slowly to his feet, positioning himself between Scott and Blake. "That dog is dangerous," Blake insisted, taking a step backward despite himself. "Warden, this proves my point about security concerns." But Warden Peterson was watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "Officer Turner," he said slowly, "have you ever encountered this dog before today?" Blake's face paled slightly. "Of course not." "Why would I have? It's just that his reaction seems quite specific." Scott was studying Blake now, really looking at him for perhaps the first time. Something about the man's face, his posture, triggered a half-formed memory. Kaiser's continued growling only intensified the sense that something significant was happening. "Kaiser was a police dog," Scott said quietly, "trained to remember scents for years, to recognize threats, to protect his handler." Blake's hand had moved from his baton to his gun, a motion that didn't go unnoticed by Warden Peterson or Officer Ramirez. "Stand down, Officer Turner," Peterson ordered sharply. "Mr. Collins, please retrieve the dog. I think this visit has reached its natural conclusion." Richard stepped forward, reaching for Kaiser's collar, but the German shepherd would not be moved. His growl had become a continuous warning, his body coiled and ready to spring. "Kaiser, come," Richard tried, his voice firm but anxious. "He won't leave while he perceives a threat," Scott explained, the pieces beginning to fall into place in his mind. "He was injured the night Janet was killed. Someone hurt him, someone he would remember." Blake's face had lost all color now. "This is ridiculous. It's just an old dog having some kind of episode. Warden, I insist we end this now." Officer Ramirez had moved closer, her expression thoughtful. "You know, it's strange. You transferred here right after Bennett's conviction was upheld on first appeal. I never made the connection before." "What connection?" Blake snapped. "There is no connection. I transferred because there was an opening, and I wanted to be closer to my mother's nursing home. It's all in my personnel file." But Scott was remembering more clearly now. The night of Janet's murder, there had been someone else in her house. A shadow, a glimpse before the blow came. And Kaiser hadn't just been injured, he'd been attacking someone, protecting Scott. "You were there," Scott said, the realization washing over him like ice water. "That night at Janet's house, you were there." The yard fell silent except for Kaiser's continuous growl. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath as the accusation hung in the air. Blake's hand tightened on his gun. "You're a convicted murderer trying to save your own skin. Nobody's going to believe the desperate lies of a dead man walking." He turned to Peterson. "Warden, this farce has gone on long enough." But Warden Peterson was looking between Kaiser and Blake with new understanding in his eyes. "Officer Turner, I'm going to have to ask you to step away and surrender your weapon to Officer Ramirez." "What?" Blake's voice rose in disbelief. "Based on a dog's behavior? This is insane." "It's a precaution," Peterson said evenly, "until we can sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," Blake shouted, his composure cracking. "Bennett killed Janet Reeves. He was convicted by a jury. He's scheduled for execution tomorrow. End of story." Kaiser's growl intensified at Blake's raised voice. Scott placed a restraining hand on the dog's back, feeling the vibration of the growl through his palm. "Why are you so invested in seeing me die, Officer Turner?" Scott asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a thunder cloud. In the tense silence that followed, the truth seemed to shimmer just beyond reach. A truth that had been buried for 7 years, that might have remained buried forever if not for the unwavering memory of a loyal German shepherd who had never forgotten the scent of the real killer. The next 48 hours unfolded with dizzying speed. Warden Peterson had ordered Scott's execution postponed pending investigation, a rare and extraordinary measure that required calls to the governor's office, the state attorney general, and the Department of Corrections. Officer Blake Turner had been placed on administrative leave, his service weapon and badge confiscated despite his vehement protests. Scott sat in an interview room, a far cry from his death row cell. The metal table was bolted to the floor, and his ankles remained shackled, but there was a paper cup of decent coffee in front of him, and more importantly, Kaiser lay at his feet. After the confrontation in the yard, Warden Peterson had made the unprecedented decision to allow the German Shepherd to remain with Scott while the investigation proceeded. It was irregular, against protocol, and precisely what was needed. "The dog stays with Bennett," Peterson had said firmly when the prison board objected. "He's the reason we're looking into this at all." Detective Marcus Holloway from the County Sheriff's Department sat across from Scott, his weathered face impassive as he reviewed the case files. At 62, Holloway was a year from retirement, with the reputation of a human bloodhound. Once he caught a scent, he never let go. He'd been reluctant to reopen a case that had been considered closed for 7 years, but the unusual circumstances and Peterson's insistence had piqued his interest. "Walk me through that night again," Holloway said, his deep voice rumbling in the small room. "From the beginning." Scott stroked Kaiser's head, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his old friend. "Janet called me around 8:30 p.m. She was upset, said she needed to talk about something important. When I asked what was wrong, she just said she'd made a terrible mistake and needed advice from someone she trusted." "And you went right over?" "After I finished grading papers." "I got to her house around 9:45. The front door was unlocked. which wasn't like her. I called out, but there was no answer. Kaiser was with me. I took him everywhere back then. He was already on alert, sensing something was wrong. Holloway made a note. Then what? We found her in the kitchen. Scott closed his eyes, the image still vivid after all these years. There was so much blood. I checked for a pulse, but she was already gone. That's when Kaiser started barking. A warning bark. I turned, and there was someone there, just a glimpse. Then something hit me. Here. He touched the back of his head where a scar remained hidden beneath his silver hair. I heard Kaiser attack, heard him yelp in pain, and then nothing, until I woke up with the police shouting at me to stay down. And you never saw the attacker's face? Just a shadow, a shape. But Kaiser saw. Kaiser knew. Scott looked down at the dog, who gazed back with complete trust. That's why he reacted to Turner the way he did. Kaiser never forgets a scent, especially one associated with danger or pain. Holloway leaned back, tapping his pen against the file. Turner's background check came back. There are some interesting gaps and inconsistencies. Like what? Like the fact that he legally changed his name from Robert Blake 10 years ago, like the restraining order filed against him by Janet Reeves 3 years before her murder, subsequently dropped when he promised to seek counseling, like the convenient transfer to Oakwood Prison immediately after your last appeal was denied. Scott felt a chill run down his spine. He knew her. More than knew her. They dated briefly when she first moved to town. According to her friends, she broke it off when his behavior became possessive and erratic. She didn't press charges after the restraining order because she felt sorry for him. Apparently, she'd helped him through a suicidal period years earlier when she was working as a crisis counselor. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture Scott had been trying to see for 7 years. So, he was obsessed with her. Looks that way. We're getting a warrant to search his residence now. But there's something else you should know. Holloway hesitated, a rare occurrence for the seasoned detective. Your original defense attorney never requested the complete DNA analysis from the crime scene. There was a second blood sample found in Janet's kitchen, type AB negative, neither yours nor hers. The prosecution dismissed it as contamination from first responders. And no one thought to check if it matched Turner. No one had any reason to suspect him at the time. He wasn't on anyone's radar. Scott sat back, trying to process everything. 7 years of his life gone because of missed connections, unasked questions, and the obsession of a man who had managed to frame him perfectly and then position himself to watch Scott's slow march toward execution. What happens now? He asked. Now we build a case. Properly, this time. Holloway gathered his papers. Turner's being questioned as we speak. The Collins couple has provided a statement about Kaiser's previous reaction to Turner at a neighborhood meeting last year. We're re-interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence. It's going to take time, but... He stopped, meeting Scott's eyes directly. You're not going anywhere tomorrow. I've made sure of that. After Holloway left, Scott remained in the interview room with Kaiser, the enormity of what was happening washing over him in waves. For so long, he'd resigned himself to death, had made his peace with the inevitability of it. Now, suddenly, there was a crack in that certainty, a small, fragile hope that threatened to hurt more than acceptance ever had. Kaiser sensed his turmoil, pressing closer against Scott's leg, resting his head on Scott's knee. Those mismatched eyes gazed up with unwavering faith, and Scott found himself smiling through tears. You never forgot, he whispered, bending to press his forehead against Kaiser's. You never stopped believing in me. Margaret Collins sat in her living room, hands trembling slightly as she handed Warden Peterson a cup of tea. Richard stood by the fireplace, his expression grave. We should have said something sooner, Margaret said, her voice thick with regret. When Kaiser reacted so strongly to Officer Turner at that meeting last year, we just didn't put it together. You couldn't have known, Peterson assured her. Turner was careful to stay in the background whenever you visited the prison for community programs. He made sure you never saw him there. Still, Richard interjected, we knew something wasn't right about Scott's conviction. Kaiser has always been the gentlest dog, unless someone threatens those he cares about. The idea that he would have allowed Scott to harm someone without intervening, it never made sense, Margaret finished. And then there were the nightmares. Peterson looked up sharply. Nightmares? Kaiser would wake up whimpering, running through the house looking for something or someone. It happened most often during thunderstorms, like the one the night of the murder. Once he actually broke through our screen door during a bad storm, trying to get to somewhere, as if he needed to protect someone. Dogs remember trauma, Peterson said thoughtfully. They process it differently than humans, but they don't forget. Margaret nodded, then stood and crossed to an old secretary desk in the corner. There's something else you should see. She returned with a small cardboard box. Kaiser dragged this out from under our porch 3 years ago. We didn't think much of it at the time, assumed it was just an old box that had blown under there. Peterson opened it carefully. Inside was a woman's wristwatch, elegant but simple, with a cracked face and a dried smear of what looked disturbingly like blood on the band. I recognized it from the news coverage, Margaret continued. It belonged to Janet Reeves. Her parents mentioned it was missing from her personal effects. Peterson stared at the watch, then at the elderly couple. You've had this for 3 years and never came forward? We didn't know what to do, Richard admitted, shame evident in his voice. By then, Scott's appeals had been exhausted. We were afraid that if we brought it to the police, they'd just say we planted it or made it up. Kaiser had found it by our house, after all, not anywhere near the crime scene. And you live? 3 doors down from Officer Turner, Margaret said quietly. He moved in about 6 years ago. Peterson carefully closed the box. I need to get this to Detective Holloway immediately. It could be crucial evidence. As he stood to leave, Margaret caught his arm. Will this help Scott? Is there still time? The warden looked at the elderly woman's hopeful face and the deep concern in her husband's eyes. They had done what they could, even if belatedly. They had cared for Kaiser all these years, preserving the one witness who could identify the real killer. Yes, he said with more confidence than he felt. There's still time. Officer Elena Ramirez stood outside the interrogation room where Blake Turner had been sitting for the past 4 hours. Through the one-way glass, she could see him, still composed, still denying everything, but with a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before Detective Holloway entered the observation area holding an evidence bag containing a woman's watch. Is that? Ramirez began. Janet Reeves's watch, yes. Found buried near Turner's property, with his DNA on it. Holloway's face was grim but satisfied. The search team also found a box in his attic containing Janet's missing jewelry, news clippings about the murder, and transcripts from all of Bennett's appeals. My God, Ramirez breathed. He's been obsessed all this time. More than obsessed. He's been collecting trophies. Holloway held up another evidence bag containing a dog collar tag. Recognize this? Ramirez peered at it. K-9 unit, Oakville PD, Kaiser's service tag? The one that went missing the night of the murder. Turner kept it as a souvenir, along with the knife he used to slash Kaiser when the dog attacked him. Ramirez felt sick. He's been working here for 5 years, walking past Bennett's cell every day, watching him deteriorate, knowing he put him there. Some killers want their victims to suffer. Others want to watch them suffer. Holloway nodded toward Turner. He's the second kind. Inside the interrogation room, Turner suddenly looked toward the one-way glass as if he could see them through it. A small, unsettling smile played at the corners of his mouth. He knows we found the evidence, Ramirez said. Yes, Holloway agreed. But he's not worried. Look at him. He's enjoying this, the attention, the drama. He's been waiting years for someone to appreciate his handiwork. Will it be enough to exonerate Bennett? That's for the courts to decide. But I've seen enough to know we've got the wrong man on death row. As if on cue, Turner leaned back in his chair, the smile widening into something cold and predatory. It was the smile of a man who believed he had nothing to lose, who had already accomplished what he set out to do, destroying the lives of two people who had dared to help the woman he couldn't possess. What neither Ramirez nor Holloway could know was that back in his apartment, in a hidden safe behind a false wall, lay the final piece of Turner's obsession. A handwritten confession detailing exactly how he had stalked Janet, killed her when she refused to reconcile, and framed Scott Bennett, the trusted colleague she had turned to instead of him. Turner had planned to read it on the day of Bennett's execution, a private celebration of his perfect crime. Now, as the evidence mounted against him, that confession would become the nail in his own coffin instead. 2 weeks into the investigation, Scott sat with Kaiser in a small courtyard reserved for privileged inmates. The German Shepherd had been officially classified as a therapeutic service animal for the duration of the inquiry, allowing him to remain at Scott's side. The arrangement was unprecedented but effective. Kaiser's presence kept Scott grounded as each new revelation about Turner emerged. They found journals in his home, Scott told Kaiser, who listened with the attentive expression that had made him such an effective police dog. Years of detailed entries about Janet, about me, about his plan. He'd been watching her for months before he killed her, keeping track of her routines, her habits. He knew she and I were close friends, knew I would come if she called for help. Kaiser rested his head on Scott's knee, offering silent comfort. He hit me with a cast-iron skillet from her kitchen, Scott continued, the recovered memories now flowing freely. You tried to protect me. You bit him, hard enough to leave scars they found on his right calf during the physical examination yesterday. He stabbed you with Janet's kitchen knife, the same one he used to kill her, then planted in my hand while I was unconscious. The dog's ears twitched at the remembered trauma, but he remained steady, his warm weight anchoring Scott to the present rather than the terrible past. All these years, Scott whispered, running his hand over Kaiser's graying muzzle. All this time, you were the only one who knew the truth, who never doubted. Footsteps approached, and Scott looked up to see Warden Peterson walking toward them, his expression unreadable. Mr. Bennett, Peterson said formally, I've just received word from the district attorney's office. In light of the overwhelming new evidence and Officer Turner's confession during interrogation yesterday, they will be filing a motion to vacate your conviction. Scott's breath caught in his throat. What does that mean exactly? It means, Peterson said, his formal demeanor softening into a genuine smile, that you're going to be a free man very soon. The judge has expedited the hearing given the unusual circumstances. It's scheduled for tomorrow morning. Kaiser, sensing the shift in emotion, sat up straighter, his tail beginning to thump against the ground. Just like that? Scott asked, disbelief warring with fragile hope. After 7 years? The system moves quickly when it needs to correct a clear injustice, Peterson replied, though they both knew this speed was the exception rather than the rule. There will be compensation discussions, formal apologies, a lot of paperwork. But the important thing is that you won't be returning to death row. You'll be going home. Home. The word echoed in Scott's mind like a half-forgotten melody. Home had stopped existing for him the moment they had led him away in handcuffs. His house had been sold to pay legal fees. His possessions scattered or stored. His life dismantled piece by piece. But looking down at Kaiser, whose tail now wagged with increasing enthusiasm as if he understood every word, Scott realized that perhaps home wasn't a place after all. Perhaps it was this, the unbreakable bond between two souls who had refused to forget each other, who had found their way back together against impossible odds. "Thank you," Scott said simply, the words inadequate for the enormity of what was happening. Peterson nodded, understanding the depth behind the simple phrase. "I should be thanking you and Kaiser. This case has exposed serious flaws in our system that need to be addressed. Your experience may help prevent similar injustices in the future." As the warden walked away, Scott buried his face in Kaiser's fur, allowing himself to truly believe, for the first time in 7 long years, that tomorrow would bring something other than another day of waiting to die. Tomorrow would bring freedom. Tomorrow would bring a second chance. Kaiser licked his cheek, tail still wagging, as if to say, "I told you so. I knew all along." The county courthouse buzzed with unusual energy for a Thursday morning. News of Scott Bennett's hearing had spread rapidly through local media channels, drawing a crowd of reporters, curious citizens, and vocal activists from both victims' rights groups and innocence projects. The small courtroom could barely contain the spectators who had arrived early to secure seats for what many were calling the most dramatic legal reversal in the county's history. Scott sat at the defense table wearing a suit provided by Richard Collins, slightly dated in style but well-fitting, dignified. It felt strange after years in Prison Orange, like wearing someone else's skin. His hands, resting on the polished wooden table, occasionally trembled with the enormity of what was happening. Kaiser lay at his feet, a special dispensation granted by Judge Samuel Thornton, who had recognized the dog's crucial role in uncovering the truth. "All rise." Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Samuel Thornton presiding. The judge, a silver-haired man with penetrating eyes and a reputation for exacting fairness, took his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom. "This is an extraordinary proceeding," he began, his resonant voice carrying easily without amplification. "I have reviewed the motion to vacate the conviction of Scott Bennett for the murder of Janet Reeves, along with the substantial new evidence presented by the district attorney's office. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a complete and compelling case for exoneration." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Scott felt a hand on his shoulder. His new attorney, Emma Blackwell, a formidable advocate from the Innocence Project who had flown in immediately upon hearing about his case. District Attorney William Grant approached the podium. Unlike his predecessor, who had prosecuted Scott 7 years earlier with righteous certainty, Grant was clearly uncomfortable with the role he now played. "Your Honor, the state of Texas moves to vacate the conviction of Scott Bennett and dismiss all charges against him with prejudice. The evidence conclusively demonstrates that Mr. Bennett was wrongfully convicted of a crime committed by Robert Blake, also known as Blake Turner, who has now confessed to the murder of Janet Reeves." Judge Thornton nodded. "The court has reviewed Mr. Turner's confession, which is detailed, consistent with physical evidence, and provides information only the true perpetrator could know. Would you summarize the additional evidence for the record, Mr. Grant?" "Yes, Your Honor." Grant cleared his throat. "Forensic re-examination of evidence from the crime scene using advanced DNA techniques unavailable at the time of the original trial identified blood belonging to Mr. Turner on the murder weapon. The victim's missing personal effects were discovered in Mr. Turner's residence, along with extensive journals documenting his obsession with Ms. Reeves and his plan to frame Mr. Bennett." He continued, reciting the damning list of evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted during the original investigation. Kaiser shifted at Scott's feet, as if recognizing the importance of what was happening. "Most significantly," Grant concluded, We have now confirmed that Mr. Turner deliberately sought employment at Oakwood Prison after Mr. Bennett's conviction specifically to monitor him and ensure his execution proceeded. This level of premeditation and ongoing malice is unprecedented in my experience. The judge turned to Scott. "Mr. Bennett, please rise." Scott stood, steadier than he expected. Kaiser rose with him, pressing against his leg in silent support. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court grants the motion to vacate your conviction. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled. The record will reflect that you have been fully exonerated." Judge Thornton removed his glasses, his formal demeanor softening. "Mr. Bennett, on behalf of the state of Texas and its justice system, I offer you a profound apology for the grave injustice you have suffered. No words can restore the 7 years taken from you, but I hope today's action begins to right this terrible wrong." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to break something inside Scott. The protective shell he had built around himself to survive 7 years of knowing he was innocent while the world believed him guilty. He remained standing as the courtroom erupted in applause and exclamations, feeling strangely disconnected from the moment he had dreamed about for so long. It was Kaiser who brought him back to himself, the warm pressure against his leg, the soft whine of concern as the dog sensed his emotional turmoil. Scott knelt down, wrapping his arms around the German shepherd's neck, anchoring himself in the one relationship that had never faltered. "We did it, buddy," he whispered against Kaiser's fur. "We're going home." As they made their way out of the courtroom, Scott was surrounded by well-wishers, reporters shouting questions, and the flashing of cameras. The Collins couple waited near the door, their eyes bright with tears of joy. Warden Peterson stood nearby, out of uniform, there by choice rather than duty. Officer Ramirez had come too, her testimony about Turner's behavior at the prison having proved crucial to the case. But it was Detective Holloway who approached Scott first, extending his hand. "I've been in law enforcement for 40 years, he said, his gravelly voice thick with emotion. "I've seen a lot of bad things, made my share of mistakes. But helping to set this right," he gestured to the papers in Scott's hand, his official documentation of freedom. "This is what the job is supposed to be about." Scott shook the detective's hand, finding no words adequate for his gratitude. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun shone with particular brilliance, as if nature itself was celebrating his freedom. The air smelled of fallen leaves and possibility. Kaiser trotted beside him, head high, seemingly aware of their victory. "What will you do now?" a reporter called out as Scott descended the courthouse steps. Scott paused, the question catching him off guard. What would he do now? 7 years on death row had not allowed for much future planning. His career was gone, his home sold, his savings depleted. Freedom was overwhelming in its sudden, vast uncertainty. "I'm going to take my dog for a very long walk," he finally answered, a smile breaking across his face. "And then we'll figure out the rest together." Robert Blake, who would forever be known by his chosen name, Blake Turner, in the annals of true crime, sat in his prison cell, staring at the blank wall before him. The irony was not lost on him that he now occupied a cell in the very facility where he had worked, watching with satisfaction as Scott Bennett deteriorated day by day. His confession had flowed easily once the evidence mounted against him, not from remorse, but from pride. He wanted the world to know how brilliantly he had orchestrated Janet's murder and Scott's framing, how perfectly he had positioned himself to witness the culmination of his revenge, how close he had come to complete success. "If it hadn't been for that damned dog," he muttered to the empty cell. He had underestimated Kaiser, had assumed that after stabbing the animal it would either die or at least forget his scent over time. He hadn't counted on the legendary memory of trained police dogs, or the unbreakable bond between Kaiser and Scott that had kept both their spirits alive through 7 years of separation. Turner flexed his right calf, feeling the pull of scar tissue where Kaiser's teeth had sunk deep on the night of the murder. The wound had required 27 stitches at an emergency clinic 2 counties away, where he had given a false name and claimed to have been bitten by a stray. The medical records had been among the evidence that sealed his fate. A guard passed by his cell, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Turner smiled coldly. He recognized the signs. He was already being ostracized, marked as a former officer who had betrayed the badge. His future held nothing but isolation, contempt, and eventually perhaps his own date with the execution chamber. But in his twisted mind, he had still won. Janet had rejected him, chosen friendship with Scott over the obsessive devotion Turner offered. She had deserved to die for that betrayal, and Scott had suffered for 7 years, lost everything, faced the ultimate punishment. Even with exoneration, Scott Bennett would never be the same man he had been before. Turner leaned back on his narrow bed, a sense of perverted satisfaction settling over him. Let them celebrate their justice. Let them call it a victory. He knew better. Some wounds never healed. Some losses could never be recovered. In the game that mattered most to him, he had not lost. He closed his eyes, conjuring Janet's face in his mind as he had seen it last, eyes wide with fear and betrayal when she realized the man she had once tried to save had come to take her life. It was still his favorite memory. "We can't possibly accept this," Scott protested, standing in the Collins' cozy living room 3 days after his release. "You've already done so much." Margaret Collins fixed him with a stern look that belied her gentle appearance. "Scott Bennett, you will not argue with me about this. Richard and I have already decided." Richard nodded in agreement. "The guest house has been empty since my mother passed 5 years ago. It's small, but it's comfortable. And it has a fenced yard perfect for Kaiser. It's yours for as long as you need it." Kaiser, sensing he was being discussed, looked up from where he lay on the rug, tail thumping against the floor. Scott ran a hand through his hair, overwhelmed by their generosity. The state's compensation for his wrongful conviction would take months to process, and while his attorney was confident the amount would be substantial under Texas law, he currently had nothing but the clothes on his back and a small stipend from the prisoner reentry program. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," he said finally. "You already have," Margaret replied, reaching down to stroke Kaiser's head. "You gave us 7 years with this wonderful boy. Now we get to help both of you start over." She straightened, practical as ever. "Besides, we're not getting any younger. Having you nearby will be a comfort to us, too." The guest house was indeed small, just a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, and living area, but to Scott, who had lived in a cell measuring 6 by 9 feet for 7 years, it felt like a palace. The windows looked out on a small garden, and beyond that, a meadow that stretched to a line of oak trees. After years of concrete and steel, the expanse of green nearly brought him to tears. Kaiser explored every corner of their new home, sniffing intently, tail wagging with approval. When he finished his inspection, he returned to Scott and sat before him, looking up with those mismatched eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. "This will work, huh?" Scott asked him. Kaiser gave a single definitive bark of agreement. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in 7 years, Scott found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. The softness of the mattress felt strange after the prison cot. The silence was both beautiful and disorienting after the constant noise of the cell block. The darkness was absolute, with no institutional lights glowing through the night. Kaiser, sensing his restlessness, jumped onto the bed, something he had never been allowed to do in their previous life together. He settled his substantial weight against Scott's side, head resting on his chest, steady heartbeat and rhythmic breathing providing comfort through their shared warmth. "Thank you," Scott whispered into the darkness, stroking the dog's fur, "for never forgetting. For saving my life." Kaiser sighed contentedly, and finally Scott closed his eyes and slept without dreams of execution or confinement, just peaceful darkness and the promise of a new day to come. Outside their window, the Texas sky stretched vast and star-filled above them. The same sky had watched over their separation, and now it witnessed their reunion and the beginning of whatever came next. After 7 years of counting down to death, Scott Bennett had been granted the most precious gift of all: time, unmeasured and full of possibility, to rebuild a life he had thought was over. And beside him, as always, was Kaiser, older now, grayer, but still the same loyal heart, the same unwavering spirit that had refused to forget, refused to give up, refused to let the truth remain buried. Together they had defied time, distance, and a justice system that had failed them both. Together they would face whatever the future held. For now, that was more than enough. 3 months into his freedom, Scott faced a new crisis. It began with a subtle change in Kaiser's behavior. The German shepherd moving more slowly in the mornings, sometimes struggling to rise from his bed, occasionally turning away from his food bowl. Scott tried to dismiss these signs as normal aging, but when Kaiser collapsed during their evening walk, his heart plummeted. "Something's wrong," Scott told Richard Collins as they lifted Kaiser gently into the back of Richard's truck. The dog's breathing was labored, his usually bright, mismatched eyes dulled with pain. "He was fine yesterday, just a little tired." "Animals hide their suffering," Richard said, his weathered face creased with concern, "especially the brave ones." They drove to the nearest veterinary hospital, Scott sitting in the back with Kaiser's head cradled in his lap, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. The German shepherd looked up at him with complete trust, even now, even in pain. That unwavering faith was almost more than Scott could bear. "You hang on, buddy," he murmured, stroking the graying fur. "We've been through worse than this, right? We're going to be fine." Dr. Catherine Mitchell met them at the emergency entrance, her efficient manner reassuring as she directed Kaiser's transfer to an examination table. In her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she exuded calm competence as her hands moved gently over Kaiser's body. "How old is he?" she asked, listening to Kaiser's heart. 12, maybe 13, Scott replied. "He was 5 when I got him as a police dog, and that was 8 years before." He trailed off, still finding it difficult to summarize his ordeal concisely. Dr. Mitchell nodded, understanding in her eyes. Kaiser's story had been all over the local news. Everyone knew how the aging German shepherd had identified his owner's true attacker after 7 years. "He's been through a lot," she said simply. The examination continued, followed by blood tests and x-rays. Scott and Richard waited in uncomfortable plastic chairs, the sterile smell of the veterinary hospital bringing back unwelcome memories of institutional confinement for Scott. When Dr. Mitchell finally returned, her expression confirmed his worst fears before she spoke a single word. "Kaiser has a serious heart condition," she said gently. "Dilated cardiomyopathy. It's common in German shepherds as they age. His heart is enlarged and not pumping efficiently. That's why he collapsed. There's also evidence of arthritis in his hips and spine, which is likely causing him significant discomfort." Scott felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. After everything they had survived together, after finding each other again against impossible odds, to lose Kaiser now seemed a cruelty beyond endurance. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. We'll start him on medication to help his heart function and manage the pain from his arthritis. With proper treatment, many dogs can have good quality of life for months, sometimes longer." She hesitated. "But I want to be clear, this is a progressive condition. We can manage it, but we can't cure it." "He just found his way back to me," Scott said, not bothering to hide the crack in his voice. "3 months ago, he saved my life. And now—" Dr. Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kaiser is a fighter, Mr. Bennett, and he has something powerful to live for, you. Don't underestimate what that means for his will to keep going." Kaiser stayed at the hospital for 3 days while his medication was adjusted and his condition stabilized. Scott barely left the waiting room, sleeping in the uncomfortable chairs, taking brief walks only when Richard or Margaret insisted. When he was finally allowed to bring Kaiser home, the dog was noticeably weaker but still wagged his tail at the sight of Scott, still pressed his head against Scott's hand with the same devotion as always. Back at the guest house, Scott converted the living room into a comfortable space for Kaiser, with a thick orthopedic bed positioned where sunlight would warm it through the bay window. He learned to administer Kaiser's medications, to recognize signs of pain or distress, to adjust their daily routine to accommodate shorter, gentler walks. Each day became precious, measured not in the countdown to an ending as his prison days had been, but in moments of connection with the companion who had saved him in every way that mattered. "We're going to get through this," Scott promised Kaiser one evening as they sat together on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in spectacular oranges and purples. "Just like everything else, right? One day at a time." Kaiser leaned against his leg, gazing up with eyes that somehow conveyed complete understanding. Despite the medications, despite Scott's careful attention, they both knew what was coming. But in this moment, with the dying sun warming their faces and the gentle spring breeze carrying the scent of new growth, they were together. After 7 years apart, each shared moment was its own small miracle. News of Kaiser's condition spread quickly through the community that had rallied around Scott's exoneration. The story of the loyal German shepherd who had identified his owner's attacker after 7 years had captured hearts far beyond their small town. As Kaiser's health declined, cards and letters arrived daily, many accompanied by donations to help with his medical expenses. "People are good, deep down," Margaret told Scott as she helped him sort through another batch of mail. "They see themselves in your story, in Kaiser's loyalty and your perseverance. It reminds them of the best parts of being human." Scott nodded, touched by the outpouring of support, but still struggling with the darkness that threatened to engulf him as Kaiser grew weaker. The compensation from the state had finally been approved, a substantial sum that would secure his future financially. But money meant nothing compared to the rapidly diminishing time with his oldest friend. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about how many people must be in prison right now, innocent like I was, without a Kaiser to save them, without anyone who believes in them." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "That bothers you a great deal, doesn't it?" "I can't stop thinking about it. Every night when I close my eyes, I see their faces. People I met inside who always maintained their innocence. People whose stories sounded implausible until you remembered that mine would have sounded the same way." "Perhaps," Margaret suggested gently, "there's a purpose in what you and Kaiser experienced, a calling that's only now becoming clear." Scott looked out the window to where Kaiser dozed in a patch of sunlight, his breathing visibly labored even in sleep. The thought had been forming in his mind for weeks now, taking shape as he witnessed Kaiser's decline and felt the acute awareness of how precious their borrowed time was. "I've been talking with Emma Blackwell from the Innocence Project," he admitted, "about using some of my compensation to start a foundation, something that would train dogs to help reinvestigate questionable convictions. Scent evidence, witness identification, that sort of thing. Kaiser's legacy, Margaret said softly. Exactly. Scott's voice strengthened with conviction. Dogs like Kaiser have abilities we're only beginning to understand. Their sense of smell, their memory for people and places, their instinctive understanding of human emotions and intentions. If Kaiser could identify Blake Turner after 7 years based on a brief encounter during a traumatic event, imagine what specially trained dogs could do to help solve cold cases or review questionable convictions. It's a wonderful idea, Scott. Truly worthy of what Kaiser did for you. Scott glanced again at the sleeping dog. I just hope he holds on long enough to see it start to become real. As if sensing he was being discussed, Kaiser lifted his head, those mismatched eyes finding Scott across the room. Despite his illness, despite his age, those eyes still held the same intelligence and devotion they always had. Scott crossed to him, kneeling beside the dog bed. What do you think, buddy? Ready to help some more people? Kaiser's tail thumped weakly against the cushion once, twice, enough to convey his answer. As spring turned to summer, Kaiser's condition continued its inexorable decline. The medications became less effective, the good days fewer and farther between. Dr. Mitchell adjusted treatments, added pain management, did everything possible to ensure Kaiser's comfort, but the reality couldn't be denied. They were running out of time. Scott channeled his grief into action, working tirelessly on establishing the foundation that would bear Kaiser's name. Emma Blackwell connected him with legal experts, nonprofit specialists, and canine training professionals. Detective Holloway, now retired, offered his expertise and connections within law enforcement. Even Warden Peterson contributed, providing insights on how to navigate the correction system to gain access to cases and evidence. Kaiser's Truth, Scott named it, in honor of the unshakable certainty with which Kaiser had identified Blake Turner after 7 years. The mission statement was simple: to harness the extraordinary abilities of specially trained dogs to help identify overlooked evidence, verify witness accounts, and potentially exonerate the wrongfully convicted. On a scorching July afternoon, Scott sat under the shade of an oak tree with Kaiser beside him on a soft blanket. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow, his once powerful body now thin despite Scott's best efforts. The local newspaper reporter who had followed their story from the beginning sat cross-legged on the grass, recording their conversation for a feature article about the new foundation. The first training class starts next month, Scott explained, one hand resting protectively on Kaiser's back. We've selected 6 dogs from shelters, all with the right temperament and aptitude for detection work. The training program combines traditional police canine methods with specialized scent discrimination techniques. And you already have cases lined up to investigate? The reporter asked. 3 to start with, all in Texas. Individuals who have maintained their innocence, whose cases have troubling inconsistencies, and where scent evidence or witness identification could be crucial. Scott stroked Kaiser's fur gently. Our goal isn't to replace traditional investigation, but to add another tool, one that might detect things humans miss, like Kaiser did for you. Scott nodded, looking down at his faithful companion. Kaiser remembered what justice system forgot, that the truth leaves traces that can't always be seen but can still be found if you know how to look for them. Kaiser stirred slightly, lifting his head to gaze up at Scott with eyes that, despite the illness clouding them, still held a spark of the fierce intelligence and loyalty that had defined him. Scott leaned down, pressing his forehead against Kaiser's, a gesture of communion they had shared countless times. "Everything I'm doing," he whispered, "everything I'll ever do from now on, It's because of you, buddy. You didn't just save my life. You're going to help save others." That night, Kaiser's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. His breathing became increasingly labored, and he couldn't rise even with Scott's help. At midnight, Scott called Dr. Mitchell, who came immediately to the guest house. "His heart is failing," she confirmed after examining him. "He's in significant distress, Scott. I think it's time to make the difficult decision." Scott knelt beside Kaiser's bed, tears flowing freely down his face. "Can he understand what's happening?" "Dogs live in the present moment more than we do," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Right now, all he knows is that you're here with him, and that's what matters most to him. Can we take him outside?" Those mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, remained fixed on Scott's face, filled with the same trust they had shown from the first day they had become partners. Through years of separation, through the miracle of reunion, to this final moment together under the stars. "You saved me," Scott whispered, stroking the soft fur between Kaiser's ears. "You never forgot me. You never stopped believing in me. And I will never, ever forget you." His voice broke. "You can rest now, my brave good boy. You've done enough. I'll carry on from here." With gentle hands, Dr. Mitchell administered the final injection. Scott felt the exact moment when Kaiser's spirit left his body, a subtle shift, a lightening, as if something essential had slipped away on the night breeze. The loyal heart that had beaten in time with his own for so many years was still. Scott sat cradling Kaiser's body for a long time after Dr. Mitchell quietly departed, promising to return in the morning. In that moment of deepest grief, he felt a curious sense of peace as well, the certainty that what he and Kaiser had shared could never truly die, that some bonds transcended even death's boundaries. "Thank you," he whispered one last time to the still form beneath the blanket. "For everything." The morning breeze seemed to carry his words away, spreading them across the awakening landscape like a blessing, like a promise, like the beginning of a story that was far from over, a story of loyalty, truth, and second chances that had only just begun. The revelation came 6 months after Kaiser's death, on a crisp January morning when frost glazed the windows of Scott's small office at the Kaiser's Truth Foundation. He sat reviewing case files, a cup of coffee cooling beside his keyboard, when Emma Blackwell burst through the door without knocking. "We found something," she announced, her normally composed face alight with excitement. "Something big." Scott straightened, instantly alert. "In the Mercer case?" Emma nodded, spreading documents across his desk. "The State Crime Lab finally released the stored evidence for our independent testing. The fibers found on Melissa Mercer's body don't match anything from James Mercer's home or car." "That's helpful, but not necessarily exonerating," Scott cautioned, ever aware of how difficult it was to overturn a conviction once the justice system had made its determination. "True, but this is," Emma pointed to a report with sections highlighted in neon yellow. "Remember how Ranger identified that peculiar scent on the clothing samples? The one that didn't match either the victim or her husband?" Scott nodded. Ranger was their star trainee, a Belgian Malinois with an extraordinary nose even by working dog standards. His alert on the 10-year-old evidence had been definitive but unexplainable until now. The lab found traces of a specific brand of mechanic's hand cleaner, the industrial kind with pumice. It contains a unique chemical signature. That's what Ranger was alerting to. And here's the kicker. James Mercer has never worked as a mechanic, never owned a car repair shop, never had any reason to use this product. But someone close to the case did, Scott said, the pieces clicking into place. Emma's smile widened. Detective Frank Whitman, the lead investigator who found the murder weapon in Mercer's garage after 2 previous searches, turned up nothing. He ran an auto repair business on the side. And our investigator just confirmed he used this exact brand of hand cleaner. Scott sat back, a familiar chill running through him. The parallels to his own case were undeniable, evidence that made perfect sense only when you considered that the person responsible for gathering it might have planted it. "We need to present this to the DA immediately," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Along with the witness statements Lola verified." Lola, a gentle bloodhound with a near supernatural ability to track human scent, had recently helped them demonstrate that the state's key witness couldn't possibly have seen James Mercer's car where she claimed on the night of the murder. The case was building, piece by methodical piece. Emma gathered the documents, her expression sobering. "Scott, this could be our first real win. 5 months of work, and we might actually bring a man home to his family." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Scott cautioned, though hope burned bright in his chest. "The system doesn't admit mistakes easily." "The system didn't count on Kaiser's truth," Emma replied with quiet confidence. "Or on you." Scott's eyes drifted to the large photograph on his office wall. Kaiser at his prime, alert and proud in his K9 unit harness, those distinctive mismatched eyes seeming to watch over the Foundation's work. Not a day passed that Scott didn't feel the absence of his partner, but the pain had gradually transformed into purposeful energy, driving him forward when obstacles seemed insurmountable. "Kaiser started this," Scott said softly. "We're just following his lead." The Mercer hearing was standing room only, the small courtroom packed with observers, legal professionals, and media drawn by the growing reputation of Kaiser's Truth Foundation. In the 18 months since its founding, the organization had consulted on dozens of cases and formally intervened in 3, but this was the first to reach the critical stage of an evidentiary hearing that could lead to exoneration. James Mercer sat at the defense table, a man aged beyond his 47 years by a decade in prison for allegedly murdering his wife. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his borrowed tie, his eyes constantly seeking out his teenage daughter in the gallery, a child who had grown up without him, who had been told her father was a murderer. Scott sat directly behind him, close enough to lean forward and offer quiet reassurance when needed. Emma handled the legal arguments with her characteristic precision, methodically dismantling the case that had seemed so solid 10 years earlier. "Your Honor," she concluded after presenting the new evidence, "the totality of these findings, the foreign fibers, the chemical signature linked to Detective Whitman, the scientifically proven impossibility of the eyewitness testimony, and the canine verification of scent evidence, creates not just reasonable doubt, but a compelling alternative theory of the crime that completely exonerates Mr. Mercer." District Attorney Grant, the same man who had moved to vacate Scott's conviction, stood with obvious reluctance. Grant had inherited both cases from his predecessor and found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending convictions that increasingly appeared to be grievous errors at best, deliberate misconduct at worst. "The state acknowledges the significant new evidence presented by the defense," he said carefully. "While we cannot at this time concede that Mr. Mercer is innocent, we do not oppose the motion for a new trial based on this evidence." Judge Eleanor Winters, known for her methodical approach and unemotional demeanor, removed her reading glasses and surveyed the courtroom. "This court has reviewed the evidence thoroughly, including the novel approach of certified scent detection canines, whose reliability has been established to the court's satisfaction through expert testimony. I find that not only is a new trial warranted, but that the evidence so substantially undermines the original conviction that Mr. Mercer should be released on his own recognizance pending the state's decision on whether to retry this case." She replaced her glasses, looking directly at the district attorney. "Given the evidence of potential misconduct by the investigating officer, I strongly suggest the state consider whether justice would be better served by dismissing all charges." The gallery erupted in muffled exclamations and scattered applause. James Mercer collapsed forward onto the table, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His daughter rushed forward despite the bailiff's half-hearted attempt to maintain decorum. Scott watched their embrace, a complicated mixture of emotions washing through him. Joy for this family being reunited, bitter understanding of the irreplaceable years lost, and threading through it all, a sense of Kaiser's presence, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the originating force that had made this moment possible. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Scott as James Mercer was led away by family members eager to take him home for the first time in a decade. "Mr. Bennett, is it significant that your first major success involves potential police misconduct, similar to your own case?" a journalist called out. Scott considered the question carefully. Kaiser's truth isn't about pointing fingers at law enforcement. The vast majority of police officers and prosecutors are dedicated professionals working to serve justice. But the system is human, which means it's fallible. What our foundation offers is an additional tool, the extraordinary sensory capabilities of dogs, to help find truth that might otherwise remain hidden. "Do you believe Detective Whitman killed Melissa Mercer?" another reporter pressed. "That's not for me to determine," Scott replied firmly. "Our job was to demonstrate that James Mercer could not have committed this crime based on scientific evidence. The investigation into who did kill Melissa should be reopened with a fresh perspective." As the questions continued, Scott noticed Detective Holloway, now a key investigator for the Foundation, standing at the edge of the crowd, holding the leash of Ranger, the Belgian Malinois whose remarkable nose had detected the crucial chemical evidence. The dog sat at perfect attention, embodying the focused determination that made these animals such extraordinary partners in the search for truth. Later, as they walked back to the Foundation offices, Holloway matched his pace to Scott's. "You know," the retired detective said thoughtfully, "in my 40 years in law enforcement, I've seen a lot of innovations in forensic science, but what you're doing here with these dogs, it's something special, something that could change the whole system for the better." Scott nodded, watching Ranger trot ahead of them, alert to every sound and scent. "I keep thinking about all the cases where scent evidence wasn't preserved properly, or wasn't considered important enough to maintain. All the times when a dog might have been able to tell us something crucial if we'd only known to ask." "Can't change the past," Holloway said, with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had seen enough of life to know its limitations. "But you're sure as hell changing the future." That evening, Scott drove out to the small hill behind the Collins property where Kaiser had been buried 18 months earlier. A simple granite marker bore his name, his years of service, and the inscription Scott had chosen: "Loyalty beyond time, truth beyond words." The setting sun painted the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples as Scott settled onto the grass beside the grave. This had become his ritual after significant moments in the Foundation's work, coming here to sit with Kaiser, to share the developments, to acknowledge the continuing partnership despite death's separation. "We did it, buddy," he said quietly, running his fingers through the grass that had grown lush over the grave. "James Mercer is going home to his family tonight because of what you started. The DA will probably dismiss all charges by the end of the week." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the nearby oak tree, carrying the sense of approaching spring. "We've got 2 more cases moving forward," Scott continued. "The Lewis appeal has been granted a hearing date, and the Rodriguez case just got approved for evidence review. The training program is expanding too, 12 new dogs starting next month, and requests coming in from innocence projects in 3 other states." He paused, watching a hawk circle lazily in the distant sky. "I still miss you every day. But I'm starting to think maybe this was the work we were always meant to do together." that everything, even the worst parts, was leading us here. As darkness began to gather, Scott remained on the hillside, sharing the quiet moment with the memory of his most faithful friend. In the valley below, lights began to appear in windows, families gathering for evening meals, lives continuing in their ordinary patterns. Among them was the Collins house, where Margaret and Richard waited with dinner and companionship that had become a crucial part of Scott's healing. And beyond that, in a small apartment across town, James Mercer was sitting down to his first meal as a free man in 10 years, surrounded by family who had never stopped believing in him. "That's your legacy," Scott whispered to the gathering darkness. "Every life restored, every truth uncovered. It all started with you, Kaiser, with your memory, your loyalty, your refusal to forget what really happened that night." He stood finally, brushing grass from his jeans, ready to rejoin the world of the living with renewed purpose. The foundation was growing beyond what he had initially imagined, demanding more of his energy and focus each day. There were grant applications to complete, training protocols to refine, cases to evaluate. The work never ended, but that was as it should be, an ongoing tribute to a partnership that had transcended ordinary boundaries. As Scott walked back down the hill toward the lights of the Collins home, he felt Kaiser's presence not as a weight of grief, but as a mantle of purpose. The German Shepherd had saved him twice, first from a wrongful execution, and then from the purposelessness that might have consumed him after exoneration. In Kaiser's memory, Scott had found not just healing, but a mission that gave meaning to everything they had endured together. The truth, once buried, had found its way to light. And in that illumination, both justice and redemption had become possible, not just for Scott Bennett and Kaiser, but for others still waiting in the shadows for someone to believe their story, for someone to help them find their way home. 5 years to the day after Scott Bennett walked out of Oakwood Prison a free man, he stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Austin Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 300 people. The annual Kaiser's Truth Foundation Gala had become one of the most anticipated events in the criminal justice reform community, drawing supporters, donors, legal professionals, and most importantly, the families of those who had been freed through the Foundation's work. "When I was released from death row," Scott began, his voice steady despite the emotion of the anniversary, "I had nothing, no home, no career, no future I could envision. All I had was Kaiser, an aging German shepherd who never forgot me through 7 years of separation, who recognized my attacker when no human would listen, who saved my life in more ways than I can count." He paused, glancing at the massive portrait of Kaiser that dominated the wall behind him, those distinctive mismatched eyes seemingly alive in the artful rendering. I couldn't have imagined then what Kaiser's legacy would become. In 5 years, the Kaiser's Truth Foundation has helped exonerate 22 wrongfully convicted individuals, 22 lives restored, 22 families made whole again. The audience applauded, many wiping tears. In the front row sat James Mercer, now the Foundation's Community Outreach Director, alongside Darnell Lewis, Marisol Rodriguez, and other exonerees who had found not just freedom, but purpose through their connection with the organization. "But tonight isn't about numbers," Scott continued. "It's about the ripple effects of truth and justice. It's about what happens when we refuse to accept that the system is infallible, when we acknowledge that mistakes, sometimes tragic ones, can be made, and when we commit ourselves to correcting those mistakes with humility and determination." Scott gestured to his right, where 6 dogs and their handlers stood at attention, the elite canine team that had revolutionized how evidence review was conducted in questionable conviction cases. "Our partners in this mission don't care about politics or prestige. They don't have egos or agendas. They simply follow the evidence where it leads, using abilities far beyond our human senses. They remind us every day that the truth leaves traces that can be found even years later if only we know how to look for them. Ranger, now a distinguished 7-year-old with a national reputation for his scent detection abilities, sat regally beside his handler. Next to him was Lola, the bloodhound whose tracking skills had proven crucial in multiple cases. The other 4 dogs, a German Shepherd, 2 Labrador Retrievers, and a Belgian Tervuren, represented the expanding capabilities of the Foundation's canine program. Tonight, I'm honored to announce that Kaiser's Truth is expanding to 3 new states, with dedicated facilities in Illinois, California, and Florida. This expansion means we'll be able to take on twice as many cases in the coming year, bringing our specialized approach to regions where access to post-conviction resources has been limited. The announcement drew enthusiastic applause. In 5 years, the Foundation had grown from Scott's one-man mission to a nationally recognized organization with a staff of 30, a training facility outside Austin, and partnerships with Innocence projects across the country. The combination of Scott's personal story, Kaiser's compelling legacy, and the Foundation's impressive success rate had attracted substantial funding from donors committed to criminal justice reform. "None of this would have been possible without Kaiser," Scott said, his voice softening as he looked up at the portrait. "A dog who refused to forget, who carried the truth through 7 years of separation, who showed us all what loyalty truly means." As the gala continued into the evening, Scott found a quiet moment to step away from the crowd, taking refuge on the convention center's terrace. The Texas night was warm, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. He leaned against the railing, loosening his tie and taking a deep breath of the fresh air. "Quite a shindig you've put together," came a familiar, gravelly voice from behind him. Scott turned to find Detective Holloway approaching, looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, but proud as he glanced back through the glass doors at the celebration inside. "Hard to believe how far we've come," Scott agreed, making room at the railing for the retired detective who had become one of his closest friends and most valued advisors. "Kaiser would be mighty proud," Holloway said, the gruffness in his voice barely concealing deeper emotion. "Though he'd probably prefer a good steak bone to all this fancy food." Scott laughed, the image perfectly capturing his old friend's practical nature. He'd be hiding under a table by now, wondering why everyone was making such a fuss. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city lights below. "Got something for you," Holloway finally said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Been holding on to it for the right moment." He handed Scott a small, worn leather object, Kaiser's original police badge, the one he had worn during his years as a K-9 officer before Scott's transition to teaching. "Where did you find this?" Scott asked, turning the badge over in his hands, memories flooding back at the tangible connection to Kaiser's early years. "Department evidence storage, if you can believe it. It was collected the night of Janet's murder along with Kaiser's collar. Blake? Turner? Whatever he called himself, he cut it off Kaiser after stabbing him, probably as some kind of sick souvenir. It's been sitting in an evidence box all these years." Scott ran his thumb over the badge, feeling the worn leather and metal, imagining Kaiser wearing it proudly as they patrolled together all those years ago. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing Holloway would understand the depth of meaning behind those inadequate words. The detective nodded, clearing his throat. "Figured tonight was appropriate. 5 years since you got out. 5 years of building something that matters." He gestured toward the ballroom. "Those people in there, the ones who got their lives back because of what you and Kaiser started, that's a legacy worth celebrating." Inside, the event continued, stories being shared, connections being made, funds being raised to support the next phase of the Foundation's work. But for Scott, this quiet moment with Kaiser's badge held more significance than all the speeches and donations combined. It was a physical reminder of where it all began, with a partnership based on trust, with a bond that had ultimately proven stronger than the system that tried to destroy it. Later that night, Scott returned to his modest home on the outskirts of Austin. He had moved from the Collins Guest House 3 years earlier when the foundation's growth required him to be closer to the office, but he still visited Richard and Margaret regularly. At 82, they remained active supporters of the foundation, their initial kindness having expanded into a mission that touched all their lives. Scott placed Kaiser's badge carefully on the shelf beside the urn containing his ashes. The simple cedar box had traveled with him from the Collins property to this new home, a constant reminder of the friend who had changed everything. Beside it stood framed photographs documenting their journey. Kaiser as a young police dog in training, the two of them at a community event. Kaiser in his later years, graying but dignified, and finally, the last photo taken of them together on the porch of the guest house just days before Kaiser's passing. "We did good today, buddy," Scott said quietly to the silent room. 22 people free who shouldn't have been behind bars, hundreds of family members reunited. And now we're expanding to help even more. The house felt especially empty tonight, the weight of the anniversary and the emotions of the gala leaving Scott acutely aware of Kaiser's absence even after all this time. He had considered getting another dog many times over the years. The trainers at the foundation had even offered him first choice of several promising puppies, but something had always held him back. It wasn't that he feared replacing Kaiser. He knew that was impossible. Rather, it was a sense that their work together wasn't quite finished, that there was more to be done before he could open his heart to a new companion. Scott was preparing for bed when his phone rang, an unusual occurrence so late in the evening. The caller ID showed Emma Blackwell's name. "Emma, everything okay?" he answered, immediately concerned. "Scott, I'm sorry to call so late, but I've just received information that couldn't wait until morning." Her voice held the controlled excitement he had come to recognize as her reaction to significant case developments. The DNA results came back on the Winters case. The Winters case. Scott sat down heavily on the edge of his bed. Anthony Winters had been on death row for 15 years for a triple homicide he had always maintained he didn't commit. The foundation had taken on his case 6 months earlier when Ranger and Lola both indicated anomalies in the preserved evidence that contradicted the prosecution's theory. "And?" Scott prompted, his heart rate accelerating. "The profile doesn't match Winters, not even close. But it does match Raymond Garza." Garza? The lead detective's former partner? Scott's mind raced through the case details. The one who testified he saw Winters near the scene? The very same. And there's more. Our investigator found financial records showing a large cash deposit to Garza's account 3 days after the murders. Money that was never explained. Scott closed his eyes, absorbing the implications. This isn't just an exoneration case anymore. This is active corruption. "Yes," Emma confirmed. "And Scott, Winters is scheduled for execution in 36 days. The familiar chill of death row's ticking clock washed over him. 36 days to save a man's life, to unravel 15 years of deliberate deception, to confront a system that resisted admitting its mistakes even when lives hung in the balance. "Call the team together," Scott said, already fully alert. The weariness of moments earlier vanished. "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., we'll need emergency motions prepared, a press strategy, and the dogs ready for additional evidence review." "Already on it," Emma replied. "See you at 7. After ending the call, Scott returned to the shelf where Kaiser's badge and ashes rested. The urgency of the Winters case stirred something deep within him, the same determination that had sustained him through his own years on death row, the same refusal to surrender to injustice that had driven Kaiser to identify Blake Turner after 7 years apart. "Looks like we got another battle ahead, partner," Scott said softly. "Another innocent man facing execution. Another truth buried by people who were supposed to protect it. He picked up Kaiser's badge, the worn leather smooth against his palm. In that moment, the years seemed to fall away, and he could almost feel Kaiser's presence beside him, alert, ready, unfaltering in his loyalty and commitment. "I know what you'd say if you were here," Scott continued, a smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "You'd say we need to get to work." As he prepared for the challenging days ahead, Scott felt a renewed sense of purpose flowing through him. Kaiser's physical presence might be gone, but his spirit lived on in every case they took, in every life they fought to save, in every buried truth they unearthed. The badge in Scott's hand was more than a memento. It was a reminder that justice, like loyalty, sometimes required extraordinary persistence against overwhelming odds. In 36 days, Anthony Winters would either be dead or free, depending on how effectively the Foundation could marshal its resources and expertise. The challenge was daunting, the opposition would be fierce, but Scott Bennett had learned the most important lesson of all during his own journey from condemned man to advocate. As long as the truth existed, there was hope of finding it. And with the right companions, both those still present and those who lived on in memory and legacy, even the most buried truths could eventually find their way into the light. Tomorrow would bring a new battle, a new chance to right a terrible wrong. Tonight, strengthened by 5 years of purpose found through tragedy, Scott finally slept. Kaiser's badge resting on the nightstand beside him, a talisman of truth, a symbol of loyalty beyond time, a promise that what they had started together would continue changing lives long after both their journeys had ended. The work was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. But in the quiet hours of this significant anniversary, Scott Bennett found peace in knowing that Kaiser's last wish, to see his human one more time, had led to so much more than either of them could have imagined. One reunion had spawned dozens more. One dog's loyalty had inspired a movement. One truth revealed had opened the door for many others. And somewhere, Scott liked to think, Kaiser was still watching over it all, those mismatched eyes still seeing what others missed, still guiding the way toward justice, one scent, one memory, one truth at a time. In a world where loyalty often seems forgotten, his last wish before execution reminds us that some bonds transcend everything, even time, prison walls, and death itself. Scott and Kaiser's journey shows us that it's never too late for second chances, that the truth always finds a way, and that our most faithful companions can change our lives in ways we never imagined. As we navigate our golden years, many of us understand loss and redemption all too well. We've said goodbye to loyal pets who were there through our darkest times. We've experienced how life can change in an instant and how purpose can emerge from our deepest pain. Scott's transformation from death row inmate to the founder of Kaiser's Truth Foundation proves that our most meaningful contributions might still lie ahead, regardless of our age or circumstances. His story reminds us that we all have the capacity to turn personal tragedy into a legacy that helps others. What faithful companion has made the biggest difference in your life? Has there been a moment when something or someone believed in you when no one else did? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and they might just inspire someone else who needs to hear them today.